Well, hello and welcome to a conversation that I've wanted to have for a very, very long time. My name's Julia Franklin. I'm what's currently known as a voice actor because most of my time I spend recording audiobooks, something I've done for about 30 years. Today, I'm having a really special treat. I have wanted for so long to talk to a very, very favourite author whose books are very close to my heart. She's Maisie Thomas, and she's the author of a series of books with which you may be quite familiar now. They're books about the railway girls, girls who took on men's jobs during the Second World War and ran and kept running the railways that were such a vital lifeline for the war effort in the UK. So, Maisie, I'm thrilled to bits to be talking to you. We've talked by email, we've talked on Twitter, and we've sent each other cards from time to time. Now we're actually hearing each other's voices in the flesh, as it were. Are you as excited as I am?
I know, it's lovely, isn't it? Because we've been in touch on and off for quite a few years.
We have.
But as you say, we've never actually had a proper conversation before. We've never heard one another's, well, I've heard your voice many times.
You've heard my working
your
voice.
Narrations.
Yeah.
With you, but this is the first conversation that we've had, and it's a great delight. I'm
Isn't
really
it a
pleased.
treat?
It is.
The special thing for me about the Railway Girls is the great heart in the book. You've really created a cast of characters that went through the whole series and touched my heart. And I know you've touched the heart of people who listen and of people who read your books. Where does it all come from, for a start? I'm starting with the hardest question. It gets easier after this.
Well, actually, several of the characters I had in my mind for quite some years before they eventually made it onto the page. So they weren't new characters to me. I was asked to come up with a group of women of diverse backgrounds to be the Railway Girls. And several of them were already there in my mind, and the rest, it just grew quite organically. And it's been a real pleasure and delight to follow their lives and to know their families and the ins and outs of everything that they do. So partly it comes from just loving exploring their characters and their personalities and their lives and their dilemmas. And also, of course, this is done within the context of the home front in the Second World War. So there's a lot of historical research to wind into the stories, to give that special background that adds, I hope, a lot of depth to the books.
Well, I agree. Certainly, I would agree that it does bring an enormous amount of depth. And your research is impeccable, Maisie, absolutely impeccable, because it has a 3D quality. I wondered, and I should have asked you this before, years ago, on an email or on Twitter, did you have family who were connected with the Railway Girls? Is there any family historical background connected with it? Because you do seem very closely connected with these characters.
Well, my parents and their brothers and sisters all served in the war in various capacities.
Yeah.
In terms of railways, my connection is, firstly, I'm married to a man. I'm very lucky. It's been such a huge support to me throughout writing all these books that I'm married to a man who loves heritage railways, and he knows lots and lots of information, and he can answer the most random railway questions off the top of his head. But my other connection with the railways, and why I especially wanted to write about them, was that my grandmother, whom I never met, she died during the war. She died when my father was quite young. She was herself orphaned quite young, and she was brought up by her step-grandfather. And I've always thought what a very special person he must have been to take on these orphaned children later in life.
Yes.
And he was a lifelong railway man. And his job on the railways, what you need to remember is that in those days, railways weren't just the railways. If you could send anything through the railways. Anything was a parcel. It could be a flock of sheep, it could be a punnet of strawberries, it could be a bunch of flowers, it could be a wooden leg. Anything could be sent by rail. And they didn't just send it from one station to the next station. They would then deliver it to your home address. Great. Or wherever you wanted it to go. And so they had this enormous delivery system, which included packet steamers to go overseas.
Right.
And the job that my grandmother's step-grandfather did all his life was he organised parcel deliveries, which meant that he had to organise the entire journey for this parcel, whatever it might be, from the station where it was picked up right to the home address of wherever it was going, which might be somewhere overseas.
There's a sort of Amazon Plus, wasn't it, really?
I know. It was just amazing when you think about it.
Yeah.
And then he had, I think, 7 children.
Gracious.
And they were spread out over about 20 years in terms of age. So the youngest girls were the similar sort of age to my grandmother, and she grew up with them. And one of them, the youngest of them, was called Jessie. And Jessie was herself a railway girl in the First World War. And she was a clerk in the First World War for the railways. So I do have a railway connection. It's just not a Second World War connection.
Yes. So you picked from personal experience and your historical research and a wonderful husband who's into heritage.
Yes.
This was always going to happen, wasn't it, Maisie, really? You were surrounded by it and influenced by it.
I know. When my agent rang me up and said, Penguin have asked if you will write this series for them, I did say to her at one point, well, I haven't got a choice. I've got to do it because if I don't, Kevin might divorce me. So, yes, there was something inevitable about it, I suppose you could say.
At the heart of this book is the great strength of friendships of your core group and the way they meet each other in the buffet at Victoria Station and leave messages for each other. And they form a really, really strong central bond, which emanates out, doesn't it? Without giving away anything for anybody who hasn't read any of the novels yet, but hopefully we're creating an appetite for it now. One of the central girls actually loses her life fairly early on in the series. And if anything, that brings them closer together. And it also opens up other relationships, doesn't it? I'll tell you something about that particular death. And I don't want to give away her name because it is a spoiler alert. But I was at home, working from home during the pandemic, recording from home then. And so I was on my own all day. And I'd been recording for, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 hours. And then this awful thing happens. And I had to stop recording and go out into the garden. And I can remember, oh dear, it's making me tear up now. I can remember sitting on a garden bench here and crying my eyes out because it was such a devastating thing to happen. And it's something that, oh yes, it really, really. And that particular death goes on reverberating throughout the whole of the series, doesn't it? So that character's mum becomes a part of the group and other people as well, and they form a much bigger friendship bond. But that was a defining moment in this series for me. It was just amazing. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. It was a very important thing to happen.
Yes.
And I hated doing it, but at the same time, it felt that it had to happen. And as you say, as a result of that, it gelled all the others into a permanent friendship group. And the character who loses her life, she is referred to all the way through the rest of the books. Just now and then she comes up because they just simply, she mattered to them, and they never forget her.
And she's a really special creation because she touches your heart straight away. She's a light-hearted girl, she's optimistic, she's fun, she's kind. And that's a genius thing to do, because they do say it's really, really hard to write about good people. You know, it's easier to write about bad people. The villains of the piece are much easier to get down on paper. With this particular character, she touches your heart pretty well from the start and stays with you, and then stays with you throughout the series. So that really was a work of considerable writing craft. It was really wonderful, Maisie. I loved it. And the response of her mother at one point is really very interesting, because we've got used to this group being kind and supportive to the mum of this character who loses her life. And it's all very kind and sympathetic and well measured and balanced, and the mum is absolutely wonderful. And then we have a passage which is far less comfortable to experience and to read, when she says how it really is. And that was another very, very searing, very heartfelt part of the novel for me. I thought that was quite exceptional. It really was. And I think readers and listeners would agree with me that that was a sensational piece of writing. Really lovely. One of the characters that everybody seems to love, people I talk to about these books, is Dot. Who's at
Dot. I knew you were going to say Dot.
Everybody loves Dot, don't they?
They do. They do.
I think I know why I love her, but why do you think people love Dot?
I think people love Dot. People, when the first book was published and the reviews started to come in, and I started to hear from not just reviewers but ordinary readers, the one character who was the real standout favourite was, as you say, Dot. And I think the reason why people like her so much is because she's very sensible and down to earth. She's a very big-hearted lady, and she's the sort of person who'd do anything for anybody. If you need help, you turn to Dot. But it's at the same time, she's very sensible, she's very no-nonsense, and she tells it like it is. And I think people appreciate that. I think they like her because she loves her sons and her grandchildren so much.
Yes.
And in the end, she's put in a position where she has to make a very important emotional choice, and for her, family comes first.
Yes.
And so I think people respond to that, and she's been very much a favourite.
Yes.
Do you, as the narrator of all the stories, you've obviously come to know everybody in the books.
Yes.
Very, very closely. Do you have a favourite character, perhaps?
Well, Dot is certainly my favourite, but it's the alliance she makes with somebody unlikely, with her very posh friend, the solicitor's wife, who has a completely different... Because Dot is... she's a Manchester woman. She's had a very hard life. She's a very difficult husband, but she rises above it all. And so, and as you say, she tells it like it is. So she forms a very unlikely friendship with a woman who is elegant, well-dressed. Her husband isn't terribly keen on her doing this railway work. And she and Dot forge this alliance, and in fact, do something really rather wonderful in one respect, because there's a really evil character who is trying to abuse his position of power, and these two women take him on. And that's a very wonderful piece of writing there. It was funny, it was powerful, it was stand up for women time. It was absolutely fantastic. And the other thing that Dot enables you to do is talk about the way in which the social order was changing during the war, where before the Second World War, the strata of class was very, very well defined indeed. And then all of a sudden, all of these barriers start to come down, and they start to call each other by their first names, and they treat each other as equals. And other people surrounding them have to get used to this new order, and you can see them shaping the society that is to come after the Second World War. So I think we did that wonderfully well. It was superb.
Yeah, one of the things that Dot says about her friendship with Cordelia, the solicitor's wife,
Yes,
is that before the war, if they had met, it would have been because she, Dot, was Cordelia's char lady.
yes,
You know, going in and doing the rough work, scrubbing the floors and things like that. But the war has changed everything. The war has given women all these opportunities to take on these jobs that have always traditionally been men's jobs, and women are finding out that they have masses of initiative and ability, and this has brought Dot and Cordelia together, and against all the odds in pre-war terms, it enables them to create this very strong friendship that I was always very proud of. That friendship, I felt it was something that it could only have happened because of the war. And I think that for all their immense social differences, which Cordelia's husband could tell you all about, it was a very real, strong bond that they created with one another.
One of the clever things about the series, from my point of view, is how you home in on a particular character who becomes the central figure in any given book. And so you're able to cover a wide range of issues, both social and women's issues. There's a really interesting character who has a coercive husband, and that's a very strong storyline that goes through, is it 2 or 3 of the novels, I think?
I think 3 in the end.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's lovely to have his villainy, and it's lovely to feel, oh, something awful's got to happen to him, and she's got to rise above it. And the way in which you've done it almost in real time, because it takes a long time for that storyline to work itself out, and it keeps popping up with menace in the background, and then it disappears again and then comes back. That's a really strong idea, and I love that, because coercion and control is very much a part of what we're talking about now, isn't it?
It is, yes.
It's an ongoing female problem for the most part. Yeah.
Yes, one of the great privileges about being asked to write a series that covers a number of years is that you can have a long-running story that stretches across several books. And this particular story, which is, it exists all the way across the series, though the character that we're talking about, I think that she's the viewpoint 3 times, so she gets 3 books.
Yes,
for us to explore her story. It's an important story because it's very relevant today, and I think it will continue to be relevant. Bad things, unfortunately, never go away, and I do get quite a lot of messages, not in reviews, but personal messages from readers who have read this particular character's story, and these ladies tell me, I was in that situation and I escaped. And that's the word they all use. They all say, I escaped. And every time I get one of these messages, I I feel such pride in these ladies for having escaped and for being able to look back and see what happened to them for what it was. But at the same time, I always think, my goodness, and how many women are still there in that kind of situation.
Yes.
So I do
a real chord there, and hopefully that whole storyline will help them to see that they're not on their own.
I've also interestingly had messages from the mothers of girls who were in that situation, and what the mothers all say is, we had no idea until there was some sort of, you know, catastrophe.
Yes.
So it's horrible, but it's a story I very much enjoyed writing. And I have to say, writing the villain is always an interesting thing to do. There's always a very special pleasure in writing a villainous character.
I must say, I enjoy voicing a villain as well.
Do you? There are so many characters in the Railway Girls series. It's an enormous cast, and nearly all of them, of course, are female. How do you prepare for something like that in terms of voicing the characters and thinking how you're going to differentiate them in your narration? How do you go about that?
Absolutely right. I've thought long and hard about that, because if you have a big cast of characters and most of them are female, and quite a lot of the Railway Girls are of an age and a similar background, so you don't want them sounding all the same. Well, I hope they don't. But what has occurred to me over the years is the way I generally prepare is to get a good idea of what they are like physically. And as I start to prepare and read what you have written, I build up a very strong physical character in my mind. I know what they wear. I know if they wear perfume. I know if they're a little bit fat. I know how tall they are, whether their shoes are hurting. When I've got all of that, then the voice just seems to come. And the stronger the writing, the easier it is, to be honest with you. You provide me with everything I absolutely need to help me to create a character. And so what I would say is it's 99% you and 1% my imagination about how this person really is in their own skin. And once I've got a feeling of what it feels like, say, to be Dot in her kitchen with her husband, Ratty Reg, giving her specs, and her frowsy daughter-in-law giving her grief, once I've got a feeling about how she physically is in that space, then that gives rise to her emotion. And it's the emotion behind the voice that helps carry it all through. It's a strange process, and it's almost difficult to describe because it kind of comes over you. And once the voice is there, it sticks. I hope it sounds consistent. It's almost like putting on a second skin, and once it's there and it fits, away we go. And you give me so much to go at, Maisie. You know, I know those girls now like I know my own family, pretty much. I know about wartime cooking now, which I didn't know before, and I've been back and had a look at my grandmother's cookbooks.
Really?
Yes, and had a look at the sort of things she cooked during the war, because there's an awful lot about food in there, and food as comfort, and the ingenious things they did with food.
Yes, one thing I do love doing is adding in all the domestic details.
Yeah.
My interest in I've always loved history. I had a marvelous history teacher at school, and that's why I write stories set in the past now, because I loved history because of Miss Smith. And the history that I'm the most interested in is social history and domestic history, and the history of costume and furniture. And as you will have noticed from the the Railway Girls books, the history of food, because the rationing and the shortages was part of everyday life in the most literal sense, and they had to be enormously creative in how they cooked and provided nutritious meals in spite of the terrible shortages that there were at the time.
It is ingenious what they did, and I think you've done a brilliant job giving us that look. In fact, I can see a whole TV program on war food based on what you've done in those books, because I was fascinated enough to go back and have a look at what my grandmother did during the war to keep her family fed. And
have you still got her cookery book?
Yes, I do. And all the best bit of it for me, it's a big old household, I think it's called the Household Cook's Book, but it's also full of loose leaf handwritten recipes that she'd picked up all over the place.
Really?
Yeah, because they used to match and swap recipes. And there's a wonderful recipe for nettle tea, which she used to make us, and ginger beer, all sorts of things that, gracious, either we don't see it anymore or we take it for granted and just buy it from Tesco or Sainsbury's or somewhere. It's a fascinating book, and reading this series inspired me to go back and take a look at that. So, yeah, thank you for that. It's opened up a new thing. Really great. Is there anything that you found difficult, or was the process of writing these books fairly straightforward once you'd got the central idea? Did you just sit and write and write and write and write, or did some bits of it cause you difficulty?
The way that I write books, I'm very disciplined, and I plan each book in great detail before I start writing.
Right.
And that's partly because when you write a series, you're thinking ahead. And so I am heading towards not just writing this book, but I'm thinking how this is going to affect the following book and the book after that. And so sometimes, just for example, at the end of book 5, which is called Hope for the Railway Girls,
Yes,
there's a very small thing that doesn't happen. And as a reader, you would be completely unaware of this. But because this small thing doesn't happen, therefore, I think in book 8,
yes,
2 of the girls have major plot lines simply because of something that didn't happen at the end of book 5. And that's why I plan very meticulously, and I'm also thinking ahead. I think that when you're writing about real events, and in my books, for example, every air raid that happens really was an air raid that took place in Manchester.
right.
Everything that you create in your fictional world obviously has to happen around all the real events, and that adds to the fictional side of things. So the thing that's popped into my head is that in one of the books about the character we were talking about a little while ago, the one that people get in touch with me and say, I had a relationship like that.
Yes.
There's a point in one of the books where she's building up to facing something very difficult and traumatic because she has to go to court.
Yes.
And she hears the church bells ringing, and it's the first time that the church bells have rung since before the war, because obviously traditionally if you hear the church bells during the war, it means that the invasion has started. But there were 1 or 2 occasions during the war where they relaxed that rule and the church bells were allowed to chime, and this was the occasion when the church bells rang after the success of the Battle of El Alamein.
Yes.
And being able to tie that in with this very emotional moment in this character's life, it was just a very appropriate thing to be able to do.
So that really comes through to me as a reader. You do seem enormously well prepared, and I think, as I said before, the research for me is impeccable, because there's a realism, there's a reality, there's a strong feeling of something you can almost touch in all these books, and they're beautifully put together. The craftsmanship is superb, and it's all paid off. Preparation is everything, isn't it? Really, I would say.
Well,
in
it
addition to talent, you have to have talent.
Thank you.
You have that in spades, but preparation is really evident. And as each book has unfurled, I thought, oh gosh, that's clever, because we had a little look at that back in book 3 and it wasn't resolved, and here it is popping up again, like a bubble in some wallpaper. Oh, we didn't quite get rid of it before, and there it is popping up again. It's been one of the most fascinating features of this very long series. So yeah, well done, because I think it's an approach that certainly works brilliantly for you, and hopefully other writers will take a leaf from your book in that respect, because they don't all, do they?
No, some people, I don't know how they do it. They make it up as they go along, and I think, how can you do that? How does that work? I like planning everything in advance, and one of the reasons that I do it is, to be honest, yes, I think it's important to do the planning and to know exactly what I'm going to be writing about, but also all my plans are shared with my editor, so that at that point she can say that she does like this, or maybe you could do that slightly differently. And it actually is the plan for me, as well as being a plan, is also the beginning of the editing process, because I would much rather write the book that the editor is going to be happy with, rather than write a book that she doesn't know anything about, that I then hand over, and then she then says, now, right, I think we need to make some changes here. Because if there's one thing I really hate in the writing process, it's having to do lots of what are called structural edits. Right. There's two kinds of edits. There's structural edits and surface edits. A surface edit means literally that you just have to add in a little bit of conversation, or you add in a little bit of detail, and you just put it in one place.
Yes.
And that's it. A structural edit, which is every writer's nightmare, is when you have to change something, and therefore you also have to change something else, and therefore you also have to change something else, and it affects the whole plot and the whole structure of the
Changes
book.
The course of the book. Yeah.
Yes.
Nightmare.
And that
nightmare.
Exactly. That is a nightmare. So the very detailed plans, as well as getting all my thoughts in order and deciding exactly what to do, that is also, to be honest with you, that is also my structural edit, because that's when the editor and I work together to make sure that before I start writing, I'm going to write something that she will be really pleased with when she gets it.
Brilliant. And I think that's quite unusual for a writer and editor to work that way. Mostly a writer will deliver the finished article and the editor then goes through. That's my understanding.
Yes.
Talking to other writers.
That's absolutely right.
In fact, I'm fascinated to hear that as a process, and maybe other writers will take up that stance, because I think it'd be very helpful indeed. Do you get a feeling of the physicality of your characters? Do you know them really well physically? Is that a thing with you?
Yes, I've always, when a character arrives in my head, normally that character is fully formed, and I know what they look like and what they sound like. I know their background, I know their name. The one thing that I sometimes struggle with is surnames.
Right.
But I know it's bizarre, but other than that, I tend to know everything that I need to know. And there will be more things that I learn as I go along and I start exploring their life. But generally speaking, they come to me as a complete package. I mean, one thing that I have just thought of on the subject of names, and this is something that I think possibly other writers also struggle with a bit, is for some reason I'm very drawn to similar names, and I have to be very strict with myself to make sure that I don't use similar names. As well as being Maisie Thomas and writing the Railway Girls series, I also write as Susanna Bavin.
Yes.
And I wrote a 1920s saga called A Respectable Woman. And in A Respectable Woman, the heroine is called Nell Hibbert.
Yes.
And Nell Hibbert was a lodger in a house owned by a very lovely elderly couple. And they were called, to start with, Leonie and Herbert. And after I've been writing for quite some time, I realised that I had Nell Hibbert and Herbert. So I thought, oh, no, can't have Herbert. So I had to change Herbert and I made him Edwin, and that was lovely. Yes. And then ages later, I suddenly realised he couldn't be Edwin either, because his son-in-law, who was the villain of the book, was Edmund. So I had Edwin and Edmund. So then I had to get rid of Edwin, and this poor chap, I then made up a name, and I called him Headley. And I honestly thought I'd made up the name, but I looked it up in, I've got a dictionary an Oxford dictionary of first names. And it turns out that Headley is a real name, so I didn't make it up at all. But at least it was nothing like any of the other names in the book. So names are something I sometimes struggle with a little bit.
Glad you brought up the fact that you are also Susanna Bavin, because I've recorded some of your books as Susanna Bavin, and I'm hugely enjoying the Home Front Girls, which is the current series. And they're unusual. This is probably the least glamorous job that took place in the Second World War, isn't it? They're girls who were sorting through salvage all the time. What we now call recycling. And the fact that you picked out this very little known group doing this hugely unglamorous job really doesn't sound like promising material for a series of books. But blow me down, you've done it yet again. You've got a lovely cast of characters whose lives are spent sorting through rubbish all day, and they have brilliantly interesting lives. So where do they come from?
Well, the idea for the salvage depot came about because there are now so many sagas set in the world of the home front, and there are various series set in factories, and there are lots of books about women in the bomb making process, and we have the Railway Girls, obviously, and Shipyard Girls, and there are lots of different jobs that are used as the foundation for various Second World War Homefront saga series. And I just wanted something that was different.
Yes,
and it is very different. But salvage, what we would call recycling, salvage was a massively important part of life in the Second World War. And everything that could be used again or put to a new purpose was put to a new purpose. Even if you were sewing or knitting and you had a few inches of thread left over or a few inches of wool left over, you would have a little bag that would be your thread bag and your wool bag. And all of those bags that people had, those little bits and pieces would end up being made into army blankets, for example, or into maps for the Admiralty. And everything was reused.
And we're such a throwaway society now.
Oh, we are, yes.
Aren't we? So this is a lovely window in on the past where people didn't expect so much and knew that they must hang on to everything possible to save it, to make possible victory against the enemy and just the daily business of living, really. So it was an essential part of their lives.
It was, and it was also at a time when, if you take the war out of the equation and you think of people's lives pre-war, people didn't have things in great quantity the way that we do today. People, for example, didn't have lots and lots of clothes. You bought the best you could and you made it last as long as you could, and you repaired it if you had to, but you bought things to last. Yes. I mean, I remember, good heavens, well, I don't remember it happening myself. It happened before I was born, but my father inherited a three-piece suite in the 1950s from his stepmother's family. He, this is...
Yeah. That would never
happen. The way that...
Would it?
Yes.
That's an amazing thing, isn't it? Inheriting.
People had much more... Things had to last.
Yes.
Then, in a way that they don't necessarily now, because as you say, yes, we are a throwaway society. But yes, I remember my father inherited this three-piece suite. And years later, when my grandmother, my mother's mother, moved house, I can remember my parents gave her this three-piece suite. It had a very strong wood frame, and they had it reupholstered for her, and off it went to a new life with my gran. And that, that piece of furniture must have been 50 or 60 years old. Easily.
That's something of a rarity now. Just while we're talking about other series, because I don't want to move away from the Home Front Girls, but I also, while we're still talking, I know we've been talking a long time now, I wanted to talk about the Surplus Girls.
Oh, yes.
Oh, I so loved that. And it had some wonderful moments. The two women who set up a business school for girls in order to give them the opportunity to develop and to have careers after the First World War, when they are sadly the surplus girls, the girls who lost their fiancés and their husbands and all their male relatives. I'm reminded of a wonderful episode in one of those books where these two sisters who are running the business school come up against their brother who wants to take over the house. And you wrote a brilliant scene with the brother and his rather unpleasant wife. And I enjoyed doing them very much, let me tell you. Oh, my word. And these two remarkable women who stand up against him. And that was, I think, one of the best passages in all your wonderful passages. That was a really stunning piece of work. And I can't even remember which one of the Surplus Girls it was, but because it's a little while ago. But I so enjoyed that, and the fact that you highlighted the plight of this whole generation of women who were going to have to rethink how to live their lives after the First World War, when so many millions of men had been killed. That was really cool.
Yes, that was. There was after the First World War. There was an entire generation of young women who had lost their opportunity to get married. And some of them obviously lost the opportunity in the sense that their sweetheart or their fiancé died. But there were many other women who lost, as it were, their potential husband. They'd never got to meet the man who they would have married.
Yes.
And this was, of course, at a time when girls were brought up specifically to get married and have families and be housewives. Women were not brought up to go out to work. Women who went out to work were widows or were very poor. But essentially, girls were brought up with the intention that they would get married and that they would not go out to work, and that their work was in the home, taking care of their husband and their children and looking after everything in a domestic sense. But suddenly you have this generation of young women for whom that no longer applies. And without the right education and without any kind of training, these girls were then in the position of facing a future where they would have to support themselves, presumably for the rest of their lives. And that's where Prudence and Patience, these two middle-aged sisters, came into it, because they set up a business school so that they could give what we would call secretarial training, so that they could help some of these girls to make lives and careers for themselves in an independent way.
Yes.
And of course, one of the things I always enjoy is if somebody dies and there's a will, and the will causes problems.
Yes.
I did it in another book where everything went wrong after the will was read, but in the first Surplus Girls book, the reading of the will is when everything suddenly falls to pieces for Prudence and Patience, and suddenly they've got to turn their lives around, and that's how their business school comes about, because they, in a different way to the real Surplus Girls, they find themselves having to create a new future.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a lovely, very graceful link between the Surplus Girls and the Railway Girls, because of the houses in which they live, some
Yes.
2 decades apart. And I can remember the producer who saw me through, I think, nearly all of the books in both of those series, said to me, "Oh, it's Wilton Close. Isn't that where the Surplus Girls are?" I said, well spotted. That's lovely. And so there's a feeling of continuity, which adds to the reality. Why not have the two series of novels just linked beautifully and elegantly in this way, just in the background, but the same bricks and mortar surround all these characters, and I thought that was charming. Absolutely lovely.
Oh, thank you. One thing I love doing is putting in little links from one book to another. And yes, you're absolutely right. The Prudence and Patience live in Wilton Close, and also the house in Wilton Close where quite a few of the characters end up living as lodgers.
Yes.
It's also in Wilton Close, on the opposite side of the road.
Yes, absolutely.
And I mean, for example, I mean, what another little link, thinking of the Surplus Girls, is in the Surplus Girls, the first book, that they have a meeting with a journalist called Mary Brewer, who writes for a magazine called Vera's Voice.
Vera's voice appears quite a bit in the book.
Vera's voice appears quite a lot. And Mary Brewer is Mary, who was the heroine of The Poor Relation.
Ah, right.
And at the end, she marries Nathaniel Brewer. And she also for very, very sharp-eyed readers, she also has a very important connection with the Railway Girls series, because you would only know this if you had read The Poor Relation, and also possibly the Surplus Girls, but definitely The Poor Relation. You would realise that she is also the mother of Fay Brewer.
Oh, right. Well, I must go now and read The Poor Relation. That's the bit that's missing in all of this. Can I ask you, I mean, you plan ahead, and your head must be still full of the Homefront Girls, the latest one. But can you give us a little hint as to what might come after the Homefront Girls?
Well, the Homefront Girls, at the time that we're having this conversation, the third book is going to be published next week.
Lovely.
And I've also written the fourth book, and I've planned the fifth book, and those two will be published next year. Those are Susanna Bavin books. And I'm also writing, I've written the first one and I'm writing the second one currently, of a new Homefront trilogy that will be published as Maisie Thomas.
Ooh.
And the first two of those books will also be out next year.
That's brilliant news for everybody. Oh, how
Thank
wonderful.
you. So I hope you'll be the narrator, because one thing.
Well, I hope I'll be the narrator too. I could let them go now.
I love your narrations so much. I've always listened to audiobooks, and I think they're massively important. My father was partially sighted, and my grandfather was legally blind. And in our house, when I was growing up, there were large print books that my father read. And to us, that was just normal, having large print books around the house. Also, they loved listening, both of them, they loved listening to Radio 4, not just because of the news and the current affairs, but because they loved the plays and the stories.
Oh, yes.
And then talking books became more of a thing, and my father started listening to talking books, and I've always listened to them. Whenever people say, what are you reading? I always have two books on the go. I have a print book and I have a talking book. Yes. Always. And one thing that I'm sure that many listeners of audiobooks do is, it's not just a matter of choosing, oh, I want to listen to that one because I love that author, or I want to listen to that one because I love that kind of story. There are also times when you think, I want to listen to that one because I love that narrator.
Well,
and you are one of my narrators that I love, and I listen to your narrations with such pleasure, and I always have, ever since the first one of your books that I listened to was in the very early 2000s, and it was a saga by Anna Jacobs called Our Polly.
Our Polly.
And I that is a story I listen to again every 2 or 3 years. I just get it out again and listen, and I love it. Yes, yeah. It is a source of great pride to me that I have you as the narrator of all my books. So thank you very much.
How lovely. Yes, well, Maisie, it's been an absolute joy and a pleasure to talk to you. I knew it would be, but it's been even better than I could have hoped for. And I'm so looking forward to the future and to reading more of your books. And maybe one day we'll actually meet in the flesh. Who knows?
That would be lovely. It'd be high time, wouldn't it? Because we've been in touch on and off for quite some time, and we have this long professional connection. Yes. And this conversation today has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for.
Thank you so much.